Valencia, and he's also MSc in meteorology and high-end computing. And with that, I'll let Keith present on the future projections for Met Éireann.
Thanks very much, Sean, and good morning to everybody. We'll share some slides here now. Great, and thank you for the invite. It's great to be first up and get to talk about one of my favorite subjects, which is the area of climate. So in this short talk, I hope to touch off 4 key areas briefly. I want to have a quick look at the basics of climate change. I want to have a look at some evidence. How do we know the climate is actually changing? What can we expect in the future? And by knowing all this, how does it actually help us out now? So let's jump straight in. And to start the morning off, we'll start with a bit of planetary physics, but I guarantee nothing you don't already know. Okay, so most of our energy comes from the sun. And when that sun's energy hits the equator, it hits at a kind of a direct hit, a 90-degree angle, perpendicular angle. So an awful lot of that energy actually goes into the earth. And I kind of like to think of it as kicking a football. If you kick the football in the middle of the football, a lot of the energy goes into that ball and it goes forward. Now, if you were to kick the same strength kick, but slice the top of the football, sure, some of the energy goes into the ball, but some of it actually gets deflected because of the incidence angle. So less energy goes into the ball. And that's very similar to how the energy actually hits the earth from the sun. So as a consequence, the equator heats warmer than the poles. And it's that temperature differential along with the spinning earth and the atmosphere, which is effectively a fluid, is what gives rise to effectively stable weather patterns. But let's leave the textbooks for a moment and let's have a look at real life. These are real images taken from geostationary meteorological satellites that are stitched together by our friends in EUMETSAT, the European Meteorological Satellite people. And we see that heating of the equator, that warm air, and we all know that warm air rises, condenses into clouds, and it drops a lot of that moisture down, the precipitation down, and that's where we get the rainforests along the equator. That now dry air comes down either side of the equator, pushes down and suppresses the clouds with some very, very dry air. And that's where we get the deserts of Australia and the Sahara. Look at Ireland. Look at the amount of active weather systems Ireland gets to other parts of the world. See how green Ireland is compared to Siberia and parts of Canada at the same latitude because of that Gulf Stream keeping us warm. So we talk about weather, we're talking about the current state of the atmosphere. Weather is what we see when we look out the window. But when we talk about climate, what we mean is the average weather over a long period of time, typically 30 years. So climate is the weather we would expect to get at a particular point at a certain time of year. And here we see Hurricane Ophelia that caused such damage there a few years ago, and unfortunately the loss of 3 lives here in Ireland as well. Okay, so when it comes to climate, it's really a simple energy balance equation, and the more we look into it, the more complicated it gets. But at its fundamental level, that energy coming from the sun, we now have the instrumentation to actually measure that, and we can see from the left-hand side, the yellow bar there, that 340 units, they're watts per meter squared, but let's call them packets of energy, come from the sun. And quite a decent portion of that manages to make to the ground. And that gets re-radiated again in the form of heat energy. Now, when we look at it, the amount of energy coming in from the sun, 340 packets of energy, and the amount of energy that leaves the earth, either through reflections or emission through the atmosphere, is 100 plus 239, so 339. So we see that 340, a slightly more amount of energy comes in than actually is going out at the moment. Now, this energy equation used to be in balance for many millennia. But what we're happening now is a very small amount is being trapped within the planet, and that's accumulating and accumulating, and that's leading to the gradual heating of the planet. And effectively, it's all down to additional greenhouse gases, anthropogenic greenhouse gases, in addition to what would naturally be there. Effectively, what's unbalancing this equation. Okay, so how do we know the climate is actually changing? Well, this is a place very close to my heart. This is Westward House and Valentia Observatory, Met Éireann's largest weather station. And this is a photograph it took about 100 years later. And I want to have a quick look at a profile of a stereotypical weather observer from Met Éireann. I'm going to call him John. Now, let's assume John worked his entire professional career, 40 years, as a weather observer at Valentia. Now think of where you are in your careers right now. Imagine you dedicated your entire 40-year career service, or more in some cases, to a single pursuit, which was the measurement of observations. And what we're seeing on the bottom graph there is that's the actual rainfall record, the top graph, the top line there in red, from Valentia Observatory from 1880 to near present. So John's 40 years service would cover something like that. But John didn't work every second of every day. John would have worked as part of a team of 6 people. So John's actual contribution to that climate record is more something like that. So you begin to get a feel of the monumental effort it takes to piece together a reliable, continuous climate record set that is required to pick out small changes at one particular location, let alone all the other weather stations around Ireland and all the other weather stations around the world. But it's because thanks to the people like John and others around the world, we can actually do that. And we can see how the temperature of the planet has gradually been changing over the last 100 plus years or so. And it's remarkably consistent. There is a steady trend of increasing warming of the planet. Let's take a look at some Irish numbers. So each orange dot here represents the average temperature in Ireland taken by people like John and his colleagues over the year. And here we're looking at a record from 1895 to near present. And it's quite a noisy signal, but the white line there is the best fit trend line to that data. And what we're seeing that over the last 100 plus years or so is that the temperature, or the climate, the average temperature of Ireland has increased by about 1 degree Celsius over that time. Now, I want to ask you this. The average temperature in Ireland during the summer, depends where you are, but give or take is about 14 degrees. And the average temperature in Ireland in the winter is give or take about 5. So 14 minus 5 is 9. So every year, Ireland goes through an average temperature change of 9 degrees Celsius without any real difficulty whatsoever. So is a change in 1 degree really that big of a deal? Well, unfortunately, the answer is yes, and let me show you why. Climate follows what we call a normal distribution, which means most of the time we get give or take in around the average, but sometimes we get either extremes. Now, if we shift the middle of that curve by even a small amount, what we're actually doing is we're actually biasing the extremes. Now, our infrastructures, our ecosystems, they all developed over a long period of time to what was considered the average conditions at the time. Very often, they're not built for the higher extreme ends. So if we're getting more higher extreme ends, that's where damage actually happens. So by changing the average temperature by even 1 degree and more into the future, we're dramatically biasing those extremes. And this isn't just theory. Here we're looking at temperatures from February, the frequency of temperatures in February over the last 60 years or so. Now, the green dots, they represent the 30-year period from mid-century. And what the navy dots represent, they represent the frequency of temperatures in February in Ireland over the last 30 years. So if we plot a normal graph over the mid-century temperatures, something like that, and if we do the same to the navy dots, which was the last 30 years, we see something closer to that. So even in the Irish records, we're actually seeing this shift, this moving of the normals. What we're seeing is that temperatures are getting warmer, and we're seeing evidence that spring is arriving earlier on average. Now, let's take a look to the future. Now, as part of a collaboration between EPA, Met Éireann, the Marine Institute, under contract to iCheck from NUI Galway, we're running climate simulations in Ireland. And here we're looking at a global model. This particular model is the EC Earth model. It's developed by hundreds of scientists all around Europe, a consortium which Met Éireann are a part of. And the idea behind these global models is that you basically develop the physics behind them, and then you run them over the past observations taken by John and all his colleagues. And you convince yourself that the model is capturing reality, capturing what's actually been measured in the past, that black line. And then when you're happy that's right, you let it go forward into the future over different emission scenarios. Many would have heard of RCPs in the past. These are different kind of agreed emission scenarios that different modeling groups work towards. The newest version of them are called SSPs, which we see here, these shared socioeconomic pathways. And what they are, they're standardized pathways into the future that take not only the radiative balance effects into account, but also socioeconomic factors as well. Stuff like globalization, Brexit, Americas, and so forth as well, how likely it is for getting global policy agreement over the line. And from that, we can get a kind of an envelope of possibilities of what we can expect of future climates. Now, these global models, they are great for getting a good feel of how the Earth is likely to change over the future, and are great for developing global policy. They're not as good at developing local policy and local action. But we're going to look here. We can borrow a trick here called downscaling. We use this in weather forecasting all the time. And the idea of downscaling is you take your global model and you take a postage stamp from that global model. And this is what Ireland and the UK would look like in some of the global models. And what you do is you break that up over a much, much finer grid. And when you're working at these finer grids, you can add on extra physics. You can add on stuff like convection, coastal effects, and run it on some of Ireland's biggest supercomputers. And from that, you can change resolutions that look along the lines of that into something more akin to that. But a question we're always asked, are they any good? Well, here, let's have a look. On the left-hand side here, these are actual rainfall observations over a 32-year period taken by people like John and his colleagues. This is what actually fell in Ireland over that period. The one on the right is these models downscaled to 18 kilometers, downscaled to 6 kilometers, downscaled to 2 kilometers. Look how good the actual downscale climate model is capturing reality. The model on the right, the actual observations on the left. So we have a great degree of confidence in these actual models. So again, we let these models run forward into the future. And we begin to kind of get some insight into what mid-century will bring. Here we're looking at some of the outputs from heat waves for a medium or a high-end emission scenario. And we begin to see contouring develop. We begin to see that there's a greater risk of more heat waves in the southeast of Ireland than the northwest. And again, this is kind of making sense to what we're seeing around Europe, in a sense that we see droughts from the Mediterranean moving towards, slowly encroaching up towards Europe. We move from heat waves and we move on to precipitation. Now, precipitation is a really interesting one in the sense that the models are suggesting that give or take the same amount of rain is expected to fall annually, maybe a little bit more, single digits, but the pattern on which that rain falls is likely to dramatically change. So we're likely to see an awful lot more heavy rainfall events happening during the winter, while a lot less rain and dry periods happen during the summer, and kind of akin to what we saw this year. So for those who remember, this February was particularly wet. It was actually record-breaking wet in areas, with nearly 2.5 amounts of rainfall falling in February this year than normal. But that was followed immediately by a very, very dry spring, and where hosepipe bans were issued across the country. So we're expecting to see more of that kind of profile in the years ahead of wet winters and dry summers. And this obviously has knock-on effects for drainage systems and water management. And then a quick look to wind. So we're actually expecting to see the wind itself actually decrease ever so slightly as we approach mid-century, about 1 to 3% depending on emission scenarios. But enough again for energy companies to be paying attention, to keep an eye on future planning and future infrastructures. Okay, so by knowing all this information, how does it actually help us out now? Okay, well, I want to introduce you to an area called climate services. And this is a big upcoming area in the area of climate science at the moment. So what it is it's actually engaging with sector experts. So let's take, for example, here, the health expert. She wants to know, does she need to plan a vaccination drive? Or are episodes like COVID more likely to happen into the future? Or are we going to see an increased risk of tropical diseases into Ireland in the next number of decades? The farmer might want to know what kind of plants to crop. Or in particular, this is very important in forestries. We need to know what species of trees should we plant now that are still performing well by mid-century. The energy expert wants to know about winds or possibly about solar energy. Is it likely to increase or decrease, and where into the future? The emergency services, perhaps what kind of infrastructure should they be investing in? Do we need to increase the number of snowplows? Can we actually let them reduce into the future? Or a big area for Ireland at the moment is the idea of water management. So, for example, there's a housing shortage in Ireland at the moment. But will the current rivers and reservoirs have enough fresh water to supply existing housing stock by mid-century, let alone all the additional new housing developments that might also tap into those same water resources? So these are all very important and very expensive capital decisions that need to be made now that are climate sensitive and will be affected by how climate changes by mid-century. So the idea behind it is you take the vast amount of meteorological data from all the models, local, global, and otherwise. And you take that socioeconomic information from the sector experts. What decision do they need to make? And what climate elements do they need to know to make that decision? And what you do is you extract just the information you need from the masses of climate data and translate it into the language and the information that that decision maker needs to make in order to benefit their citizens in their particular sector. And by merging all that together, you create a series of climate services or products enabled to help decision makers. And a lot of these will be cross-sectoral as well, from the point of view that a lot of the, let's say, change in precipitation, rainfall events into the future, once you develop products along those kind of lines and they're nationalized and standardized, well, they're as much use to water management people as they are to, let's say, the people building the drainage and the road systems and so forth. Okay, and the reason this area is really an upcoming area at the moment is because in the more recent past, an awful lot of effort was going into the climate science, which it still obviously is, but there's a big push on bigger computers, developing better models, better modeling teams, better observations, and better equipment. And that push is still happening. And it was generating a lot of big data. We don't hear that phrase as much anymore. But that big data was able to convince global policymakers in order to put globally binding policies in place, in particular the Paris Accord and others. And that Paris Accord then filtered down to European policy and national policy. But now, not just in Ireland, but elsewhere around the world, the focus is really moving to actually implementing those policies, actually taking action. And in order to take action, you need to make decisions. And in order to make decisions, you need to know this information on the climate in order to make those valuable decisions. And that's why, again, not just in Ireland, but globally, the whole area of climate services is really expanding. And I see that's an area where we're likely to engage with the engineering community a lot more in the near future. Well, I'm out of time for this morning, so I'll leave it there and I'll pass you back to Sean. And I wish you well with the rest of your presence today.
Thanks very much, Keith. That is very useful information and gives us a good view into the potential changes coming forward, and sets a useful context for our next speaker, Ciaran Hayes. He's the CEO of Sligo Local Authority, the chair of the National Local Authority Climate Action Steering Committee for the CCMA. He's a member of the Climate Change Advisory Council Adaptation Committee, and he's served strongly over the last 42 years in local authorities across the country, and I understand that this is his final year and he's due to take a well-deserved break. So with that, I introduce Ciaran to give us an overview of the strategic approach by local authorities.
Thanks very much, Sean. And indeed, thanks for the invitation. Not only is it my final year, coming into my final month, so just bear with me while I share the screen. Okay, and hopefully that's coming up for you there. Okay, so good morning, and thanks again for the invitation. So that's who I am. And I suppose I'm conscious of the audience this morning, which is on the whole area of engineering and the consultant engineers. And I suppose the photograph there gives an indication of a number of areas where, from a local government perspective, there has been a huge emphasis in the engineering now. Certainly the road side is, from a career path point of view, within local government, roads and road design would have been a key area. And water services, I suppose, is come second to that. After that, the areas of perhaps planning, where some engineers would have been involved in previous years, are housing and environment. I suppose they'd be the lesser areas of demand from an engineering perspective. However, that's all changing, and changing quite rapidly, because of some of the decisions that have to be made now arising, that as highlighted there by Keith in the last presentation. When I was looking at this some years ago, back in 2015, when the legislation was being formulated inside in Custom House, and it was quite clear to me that, representing the CCMA, that there was a lot of stuff coming tracks at us in the area of climate. And when I analysed the sector, it was also clear that we weren't necessarily ready. While we had some expertise within the system, we didn't have sufficient expertise and competence within the entire sector. So I pulled together a committee from around the country, and we put a business plan together, looking at the risks and looking at the essentially what was coming at us from a climate change perspective. And it was quite clear that the growth area from a local government perspective was going to be in the area of the environment, and more particularly in the area of climate change. So we put a business plan together, and we ended up getting funding from the department, which went to fulfill established 4 climate action regional offices. The 2 along the western seaboard, all climate action offices, I should say, which are up and running now 2 years, they deal with all issues climate change, and the 2 on the western seaboard have an additional responsibility, which is to look at the issue of coastal flooding. The one in the Midlands, in the green area, has an additional responsibility to look at fluvial flooding, while the one in Dublin, we've asked them to look at the issue of the urban effects, the urban impact of climate change. And all of those, whatever experience is gained by one office is fully transferable throughout the entire sector. On the left-hand side there, you see the areas in which the CARO offices are involved. I'm not going to go into them in any detail. David Dodd, presenting behind me, will cover it in far more detail, but you can see the level of interaction there. And what has happened in the last 2 years, the CAROs have built up a certain momentum, and they certainly have been of assistance, and they have established themselves as that 4 teams of expertise, providing a very vital service to the local government sector, to the 31 local authorities throughout the country. So very quickly on the adaptation side, we were all tasked, all local authorities were tasked with putting a statutory adaptation plan together by the end of September last year. And again, because of the advice and guidance of the CAROs, all local authorities were able to meet that deadline. And the interesting thing is, because climate doesn't essentially respect borders, the interesting thing is that they were all done to a very consistent and high standard. David will go into this in much more detail, but we're now delving into areas where, any of those who know local government, they know that we operate on the basis of tradition, precedent, custom and practice and so on. But we're now delving into areas that don't really have any tradition or precedent within our sector. The whole issue of decarbonised zones, which again David will go into, creation of woodland on public lands, regional energy bureaus. These are all relatively new from a local government perspective. The issue of communication then is also going to challenge us, and again we'll go into that in a little bit more detail. And while the CARO offices are regional, they can deal with some of the communication issues, but essentially it's going to come down to the local level to be able to get involved with each of the local organisations operating at that very, very local level. One of the things that the CARO office in Kildare has championed or led out on is the whole area of training and education. And when you consider that we have 28,000 in round figures within 28,000 staff within the sector, and what we're trying to do here is be quite ambitious. Essentially, we're saying that each one of those staff will require to be trained to some level with regard to climate change, in the same way that we train people in the area of health and safety over the years. And they have formed a bespoke training program, quite a detailed training program, divided into 6 modules, targeting each level of within the organization. And the first one there, championing leadership, is targeted at the senior management and councillors, elected members, and so on. And that's starting here in Sligo this Friday. It's being piloted and then rolled out. It's being the contract for that has been awarded to Limerick IT, and they're piloting it here in Sligo this week. So it'll be interesting now to see how that's taking shape. But ultimately, every engineer who's involved in, whether it's road design, housing construction, bridges, whatever, traffic management, transport planning, architects involved in the design of particular schemes, technicians, all will have to be involved, all will have to advance their particular function under a climate change remit. They'll have to prove their particular work from a climate change perspective. The same will apply to the staff that we have working in the front line, staff dealing with chambers of commerce, tidy towns committees, local community development companies, and so on. One of the things that in putting the training plan together, one of the things that we wanted them to do was to be quite comprehensive. So we're actually providing training, or providing an opportunity for the Office of Planning Regulator to be involved in the training process as well. And this, I suppose, leads to or is informed by the requirement of the OPR to ensure that from a planning perspective and a development plan point of view, climate change is factored in there from the outset. I was also very anxious that in establishing the Climate Action Regional Offices, the CAROs, that each would be assigned or aligned to a 3rd level institution within their area, and the 3rd level is reflected in the development of the training program also, as are other statutory agencies like the SEAI, Irish Water, and so on. So it's quite a comprehensive program. And to be honest, while it's ambitious from a local government point of view, I actually think that with tweaking, this has the capability of being adapted for rollout within all government departments and other statutory agencies, and not just the local government sector. And as I was saying, each CARO office is aligned with a 3rd level institution. So what's happening now in effect is we are building up that level of knowledge. We're building up that inventory of climate action funding and getting involved in research. So the expertise that wasn't available to the sector in previous years is now starting to be available. And it's quite interesting that quite often in an Irish context, we look elsewhere, we look abroad for best practice. It's quite interesting in this case now that the Institute of Local Government in the UK noted that the CARO model is something to be replicated in the UK, stating that government should also consider the Irish model of climate action regional offices designed to support local delivery, and that these could be hubs for developing plans, sharing expertise, and diffusing good practice, as well as coordinating with arm's length bodies active in the region. Also, earlier this year, on 14th of January, we launched a publication, which was, in essence, it was a compendium of various different actions undertaken by each local authority in the area of climate change. However, when you actually stand back and analyze it, what it is just that it's a compendium. And to my mind, we actually needed to be taking this to another level entirely. If you take one area, for example, there are a number of local authorities around the country that have achieved ISO standard 50001, which is in the area of energy management. But from a sectoral point of view, ideally the entire sector should be aiming to achieve that particular standard rather than having it on a hit and miss basis throughout the organizations. I just use that as one example. And conscious also of the fact that targets were increasing and continuing to increase throughout throughout Europe, I mean globally in fact, the bar was only going to become ever higher from a local government perspective. So it was an ideal opportunity for us to stand back and take a strategic management look at and see, well, exactly where is it we want to be in a number of years' time. And then the issue is, okay, we decide where we want to be, how do we get there? So we took a very strategic management approach to where we were at. We didn't want to rest necessarily on the laurels of having the CAROs established and away we go. And when you examine and analyze the reach of the local authorities, they have a reach into every aspect of the local communities. Plus, when you take each policy domain, and Keith was referring there to the science and the information and data that is required to go into various policies. So each of those policies are formed. They're all driven by national government departments. And the issue then is how you actually implement those national policies at a local level. And that's where the local government and local authorities are strategically positioned within that structure to be able to deliver national policies at local level, given their interaction with each of those agencies locally. As with all strategic management initiatives and with all strategy documents, we have a vision, a mission, and various goals. Now, there's nothing in here, I'm not going to go into these in any detail because there's nothing in here that should be of any surprise. Fostering governance and leadership, adapting to climate adaptation, climate resilience, mobilizing climate action in local communities, and so on. There's nothing there of any surprise. So we submitted the strategy document to the department plus 2 business plans, which I'll come to in the next slide. But in submitting the strategy, we're now actually in the process of tweaking that strategy document, but we're tweaking it now to align it to the program for government and to align it to the minister's priorities. So the work that we have done is certainly feeding into the overall government effort, and it is a form of joining the dots. So my sense is that our own strategy will now be seen as a vehicle for implementing, a really good vehicle for implementing national policy at local level. We're taking, unlike in previous years, again, anybody who would be familiar with the local government structures, when something new comes down the tracks at us, we've often had a tendency to tag it on to somebody else's job and ask them to devote a certain amount of percentage of their time to that particular function. Not so in this case. We're taking a very structured approach to it. And what we're doing is we're dividing it into various sectoral areas like energy and emissions management, internal change, climate adaptation, community capacity building, biodiversity and land use planning, coordination, and so on. So we're taking a very structured approach to it. As I mentioned earlier, we've put together a number of business plans. One business plan is for the additional resources required for the CARO offices on the left-hand side of the screen there of the slide. And the other is additional resources required by the local government structure. And all of this is to support the sector in being able to deliver on national government policy and be able to achieve the aims, the climate change aims. We're also putting together a governance structure. It's not simple to ensure that 31 local authorities are able to move forward at a similar pace, but that's the structure that we're putting in place. I'm not going into that in any detail, just to say that it's there. But then turn to the practical issues on the ground. This is the easy bit. This is 14 apartments that we've just built, social housing units. And because it's a new build, we were able to build them to an NZEB standard. They're all near zero energy buildings. The energy costs for the tenants in this case range between €7.50 and €8 per week. That's for the heating and all the appliances, which by any standards is quite a good outcome. We also have an interesting project here where we had an infill site, And we're just in the process now. The tenant is in this house, another NZ building, but the tenant is here almost a year. And we're in a position now to get the data for the year's energy bill for this house and compare it with the year's energy costs that the tenant has from a previous year. So it'll be interesting to be able to analyze that data and see what the outcome is. But this is the hard piece. In this case, and there are in the region upwards of 40,000 of these houses around the country. And this is where, from an engineering perspective, there certainly will be additional work and additional projects to be advanced around the country. And additional resources will, I understand, will be devoted to this from government. So these are late 70s, early 80s construction, very poor construction, very poor standards, poor insulation, poor air tightness, and because people in these high density social housing areas and because people are on the margins, they're also in fuel poverty, and because of that they buy the cheapest and the dirtiest fuel, which in turn, and as you can see from the photograph, gives rise to air quality and other environmental issues, and that in turn gives rise to adverse health conditions. So in this particular scheme in Sligo, we're advancing an urban regeneration project, and we've 21 million from the government, and we're upgrading the housing itself. But in doing that upgrading, we've also been able to measure the carbon savings arising from the particular project, and we've been able to trade those savings on the emissions trading scheme, the ETS scheme, and we reckon we can get in the region of 300,000 from trading the carbon savings on that scheme, and we'll be ploughing that 300,000 right back into the community as part of our matched funding for a local community centre. Also, I want to install here, and we're in the process of installing air quality monitors, and what I want to be able to do is correlate, gather the data over time and correlate the improving air quality data with the local hospital, try and correlate it with the admissions to the local hospital for respiratory illnesses. I think that'll be quite important in the context of the current COVID-19 pandemic that we're in the middle of. But this is the interesting bit. We're starting now to get data back from the tenants themselves. And the savings are phenomenal. They're far greater than I would have anticipated. I certainly anticipated some savings, but the savings that we're getting now are far greater than ever anticipated. And to be honest, what's happening now is we've been able to use this data and use the willing participation of the tenants. They're now essentially ambassadors. We now have other tenants, rather than being hesitant and reticent about the change, they're now looking to be the next house to be converted over and upgraded. So there's a real piece of work here for us to be done in using this data and trying to convince other residential areas, particularly private residential areas, to convert over to the new systems. Currently, we have, on the renewable side, 30% of our energy, our electricity requirement is generated by renewable energies, 70% by fossil fuels, and the government policy is to flip that over and have 70% generated by renewables. Now, everybody is in favor of clean, green energy, but nobody wants it in their backyard. And this is where we're, as a local government sector, we're right in the middle. I anticipate that we'll be involved in collaborations with the likes of EirGrid on the one hand, and the energy generators on the one hand, and the local communities on the other. And there's a real piece of work, and there's certainly going to be, it is a growth area for the consultant engineering side. And to my mind, any projects in this area will have to come with a requirement. I can certainly envisage consultant engineers having a requirement for local consultation and experience in the area of local consultation to try and get these across the line. And again, the local government sector will be right in the middle of this. I had a great idea at one time a year or two ago, and given that 70% of the target is that for 70% of our energy, our electricity, to be generated by renewables. And the issue is that when the wind blows, the energy needs to go somewhere, and when it doesn't blow, you need to pull it back. So I had a great notion that at one stage that the local government sector could combine and use its network of swimming pools as an energy sink, so that when the wind did blow and the energy needed to go somewhere, you could put it into the swimming pools and heat them by an extra couple of degrees. And when the wind didn't blow, you pulled it back and you cooled down the network of pools by that 2 degrees. Now, it has proved to be a little bit more difficult than that. However, there's certainly a challenge out there for the consultant engineering side to be able to come up with solutions. And these are new and innovative and unique solutions in order to deal with the changing energy landscape that we're facing into. This is another area, and this is quite an interesting project in Caird Park and Dundee City Council in Scotland. And if you think about it, what they've done here is they've been able to tap into the geothermal energy and use that geothermal energy to provide some of the energy requirements in the adjoining leisure centres and even put it into district heating schemes. Now, if you think about it in an Irish context, every local authority has open space, parks and open spaces, and we're all technically there's no reason why the geothermal and other energy cannot be tapped into. Equally, we're all involved in the development of involved in collaborating with the likes of the IDA, and we're all involved in zoning areas for industrial development. And there is no reason whatsoever why technically we cannot ensure that the development of these areas is done in a carbon neutral way. So we're delving into areas that are technically possible, but we don't have a tradition, I suppose, in these areas. One of my final slides then is just to mention it. I mentioned collaboration already. This is an area, here we have a situation with 2 national bodies, one a statutory agency, one a sporting body. But the common bond here between the 2 of us is that each of us has a reach into every parish in this country. And the whole issue here is to try and win over the hearts and minds. And if we're in a position, for example, with the GAA clubs, so that the GAA clubs reduce their energy requirement, they're able to use renewable energies, for example, empowering their floodlighting systems for training in the evening. That's what's going to be spoken about in the pubs. And that's what's going to win over the hearts and minds. And that's the space that we all need to get into. So that brings me right back to the end, and apologies if I've gone over slightly on time. But essentially what I've been saying is, from an engineering perspective, I think the age-old tradition of roads being the preferred choice from a career path perspective in local government, that's changing, and it's changing rapidly. And what's changing it is the onset of and the requirement to deal with our climate change issues. So thank you very much, and again, apologies if I've gone over.
Okay, thanks very much, Ciaran. That was an excellent example of the strategic role of local authorities and activities going on in local authorities. We're going to take questions and answers in the questions and answer session at the end, just in order to manage time. And we have a few questions there. If you're asking questions, please ask them through the Q&A box and not the chat box. Our next speaker is David Dodd. He's the Regional Coordinator for the Dublin Metropolitan Climate Action Regional Office. He's an environmental scientist. He's worked as an advisor in the Department of Environment, Climate Action and Communications. He's also worked in the EPA and spent some time working on the consultancy side as well. David is going to give us an overview of the climate action regional offices, and I think cooperation, at a regional level. So with that, I'll introduce David to give his presentation. Thank you, David.
Thanks, Sean, and good morning, everyone. Just to check that you can see my screen before I start.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks. So thanks for the invitation, particularly thanks to Sean. As you mentioned, I did spend a couple of years in the Custom House. We had many an interesting discussion as to how we could improve building regulations, but also reduce the amount of solid fuel houses we're using and improve air quality and environmental benefits. So great to be back speaking to an engineering audience in terms of climate action. So I'm going to touch in a little bit more detail on some of the things that Ciaran mentioned. So the CARO offices, I suppose we do have funding from the Department of Communications, Climate Action and Environment, should I say, the Department of Environment, Climate and Communications, their new name, on a 5-year basis. And I suppose our key mandate is really to build on the experience and expertise that is already in the local authority sector. Mindful that, you know, just because the CAROs are set up, local authorities have been in this space for a long time. Local authorities are the first responders in terms of extreme weather events, in terms of coastal flooding, in terms of river flooding, in terms of weather events. For many, many years, they've been involved in road design, I suppose previously in the decades ago, and more on the construction and design side, now more on a project management basis. Also involved, obviously, a key role in terms of planning and facilitating development at a local level. So the CAROs are really designed to, I suppose, drive the climate action and build capacity within the local authority sector. As Ciaran said, to coordinate, to share experience and share good practice that's already there and that already has been done by the local authority sector. We do very much have a key role in terms of coordinating engagement, not just across local authorities, but in terms of across various agencies such as Met Éireann, EPA, SEI, as well as government departments, and I'll touch on that in some later slides. And also, I suppose, to translate some of the adaptation and climate mitigation efforts that are happening at a sectoral level down to the local level. So how can local authorities interact with various departments and agencies, and indeed with the private sector? We are led by I suppose a lead department in each of the 4 areas. So in the Dublin regional area, so that's for the local authorities of Fingal, South Dublin, Dún Laoghaire, and Dublin City. Dublin City are the lead local authority there, and in terms of the 3 other CARO regions in the East and Midlands, it's Kildare in conjunction with Kilkenny County Council would be the lead authorities there. In the Atlantic Seaboard South, it would be Cork County Council, and in Atlantic Seaboard North, it would be Mayo County Council, and contact details for the coordinators would be at the end of the presentation. I'm not going to go into this slide because Ciaran has mentioned it, but just I suppose to reiterate that the CARO work programme is quite broad, and I'll give some examples from some of those areas, but not all given the time that we have this morning. So just a little bit to start on, some of you will be familiar, but maybe not all, in terms of, you know, where does local authority and sectoral climate policy in Ireland fit into the global situation in terms of climate policy. So I suppose at the very top we have international conventions like the United Nations Framework on Climate Change, and at a scientific level the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, feeds in peer-reviewed research and science into the UN in terms of what are the impacts and what needs to be done to adapt to some of these impacts, and indeed to mitigate the impacts in terms of reducing our greenhouse gas emissions, and what are socioeconomic impacts of that. And those international conventions, I suppose, filter down to European level in terms of what would be called an effort sharing decision. So how the various emission reduction targets are spread amongst member states. And I suppose more recently, the European Green Deal, and how the Green Deal can not just tackle climate change, but also, I suppose, provide for more sustainable communities and economies through things like circular economy, more sustainable agriculture, green public procurement, etc. And that filters down at a national level to the likes of the National Adaptation Framework, which is a key framework which mandated that local authorities prepare local authority adaptation plans and sectoral adaptation plans as well. More recently, we've had the cross-party Oireachtas climate change report. We have obviously Ireland's 2040 National Planning Framework. Last year, we had the publication of the Climate Action Plan 2019. And more recently, a couple of weeks ago, we had the draft publication of the Low Carbon Climate Action Development Bill. And these policy requirements feed down to the sectoral plans. So there are sectoral plans across a number of sectors. I have a slide on it in a moment. And actions from those sectoral adaptation plans then feed down to the local authority. And certainly not at the bottom rung, but at the bottom of this particular slide, the examples of Dublin City Council Climate Change Action Plan, Mayo, Cork, and Kildare. The sectoral adaptation plans, as I mentioned, are listed here, and they can all be found on a slide I'm going to show shortly, or on individual department or agency websites. But these are the sectors on the slide. So everything from agriculture through to, you know, water quality, water services, infrastructure, and they all detail, I suppose, the risks that the various sectors pose, that climate change poses, and outline, I suppose, key actions and objectives in terms of the sectoral adaptation policy and how to deal with climate action in these areas. So they are key policy documents for these sectors. At a local authority level, development guidelines were prepared by the department, very much in conjunction with Climate Ireland, to develop these guidelines as part of an EPA-funded project a number of years back. And they're very much, I suppose, a lot of you will be familiar with the ISO type approach, but preparing the ground, assessing the adaptation baseline. So, you know, what impacts have we experienced? What impacts will we experience in the future? So identifying future climate impacts, vulnerabilities and risks. And then looking to prioritize and identify actions as to how we deal with those particular hazards. So is it coastal erosion? Is it river flooding? Is it urban heat? Is it water stress? What are the particular hazards that are being faced in particular areas? And then drafting, implementing and monitoring the strategy. And as Ciaran said, local authorities and sectors submitted their first climate change action plans, climate adaptation plans to governments last September 2019. And a couple of weeks ago, local authorities submitted their first annual progress reports to governments on how those adaptation and action plans are going. For those of you who'd like to find out more about the adaptation plans at a local authority level and the sector level, I would direct you to Climate Ireland. Climate Ireland is Ireland's climate adaptation portal, started from an EPA-funded project over 10 years ago, and now is a key resource in terms of adaptation planning guidance for local authorities and sectors. And this particular map, you can access it on a county basis by clicking on the county and downloading the adaptation or action plan and also the sectoral plans. I saw in one of the Q&A there already that someone asked about the Climate Action Charter, so good to know I've included the right content in the presentation. But I suppose we have had quite a lot of change in the climate action area in a very short period of time. And the Climate Action Plan, I suppose, outlines the ambition for the country as a whole, and that includes the public sector and local authority sector. And one of the key requirements of the Climate Action Plan for the local authority sector was to agree a Climate Action Charter with local authorities. And that charter was signed, but the image on the left-hand side by Paddy Mahon and the CCMA and former Minister Richard Bruton and Sean Kinder. That was signed in November 2019 last year, and it is quite ambitious. Covers everything from energy reduction to, you know, climate resilience to green public procurement and our role in terms of the communities and collaboration wider. So we can touch on that in the Q&A in a little bit more detail. Also, some of you will be aware that the draft climate bill was published in October, the Climate Action Low Carbon Development Bill, and not to go through the bill in detail in the interest of time, but the role of the local authority is outlined in there in terms of requiring local authorities to prepare a climate action plan. And you may ask, has he not just talked about climate action plans? But the National Adaptation Framework actually required local authorities to prepare climate adaptation plan. So it didn't cover, I suppose, maybe a lot of the energy reduction piece, the buildings, the transport piece, and I'll come to that shortly. Some local authorities did prepare a climate action plan for Dublin's, for example, Meath and Cork have some mitigation examples in their action plans. So this is, I suppose, a new requirement for the local authority sector. I'm going to talk about mitigation and adaptation. I know some of these terms get used interchangeably, but very much, I suppose, in terms of climate literature and climate science, adaptation is taken to mean actions that manage and reduce the negative impacts of climate change. Those impacts which we have already experienced through, you know, increasing storm events, stronger storm events, and the future events that we will experience. And then mitigation, I suppose, looks at actions that can reduce the emissions, the greenhouse gas emissions that we know are contributing to climate change, and as Keith has eloquently detailed in his presentation at the start. And then I suppose the bit in the middle, the climate proofing, water conservation, locally sourced food, you know, there's a big overlap. Climate proofing is a big area, I suppose, that role of spatial planning in terms of how do we actually implement mitigation actions like sustainable transport, like renewable energy and energy efficiency, and how do we deal with things like coastal erosion and river flooding in terms of the planning system. and also, you know, the key role that local authority and emergency response agencies and departments have in terms of disaster management and emergency response too. So just to give you an example, because Sean did ask me to sort of outline what a climate action plan might entail, just to fly the Dublin flag for a couple of minutes. This is, I suppose, outlining the 5 key thematic areas and the 4 key targets in the 4 Dublin climate change action plans. So for Fingal, South Dublin, Dún Laoghaire and Dublin City. And these plans were developed in close conjunction with CODEMA, Dublin Energy Agency, over a number of years, and directly with the local authority staff. And they covered 5 key thematic areas of energy and buildings, transport, flood resilience, nature-based solutions, resource management, so in terms of waste, water, etc. And the 4 key targets being 33% in energy efficiency by 2020, a 40% reduction in council's greenhouse gas emissions by 2030, making Dublin a climate resilient region, and actively engaging and informing our citizens on climate change. So, as I said, these are for the Dublin plans. There is a requirement in the new climate bill for all local authorities to prepare climate action plans. They may be similar to this, but just a point to note that these were developed on the European Covenant of Mayors system, which some of you may be familiar with, which is, I suppose, an organization of cities and mayors across Europe. And it mandates the requirement for development of a sustainable energy and climate action plan, a CCAP. So the Dublin plans were very much based around the European Covenant of Mayors model. Just a couple of examples to break up some of the text in terms of mitigations, you know, everything from fleet transition at the local authority level in terms of moving away from petrol and diesel to electrification, and indeed other low emission sources. I don't think it's all about electric. There is certainly going to be a role for hydrogen and other sources in the future. You know, we've seen in recent months a very strong role that active transport providing good quality cycling infrastructure and also pedestrian infrastructure to allow that modal shift to happen. Public lighting in terms of, you know, replacing old sodium light bulbs with low emission, low energy use LEDs, the retrofitting piece that Ciaran has touched on, and I suppose the new builds in terms of you know, pushing the boundaries in terms of energy efficiency for new builds and reducing the, I suppose, some of the impacts like air quality that solid fuel burning and fossil fuel burning can have. And the adaptation side, you know, a lot of you in the audience, particularly from a consultancy background or indeed from a local authority background, these are, you know, all projects undertaken by local authorities, whether they be flood prevention projects. Some of them are in the private sector, green roofs on top of shopping centres, which have been mandated as part of planning conditions. Coastal erosion, indeed a really key area, and really positive that a new coastal change strategy working group has been set up and is being chaired by the Department of Housing and Local Planning and Local Government, because it is a key area for many local authorities around the country. Water resource management, you know, driving down resource use, plastic use, waste prevention, waste minimisation and waste management, a key role for local authorities, and indeed a key role in terms of driving down our emissions and resource use. Now, we have a biodiversity emergency as well as a climate change emergency, and really that provision and maintenance and indeed creation of new public spaces and nature-based solutions is a key role, as well as the key role, in at least in an urban context, of sustainable urban drainage systems and natural water retention measures in terms of capturing those heavy rainfall events that Keith talked about, and taking some of that water out of the drainage system and reducing the pressure on wastewater treatment plants and impacts on rivers and streams, etc. Ciaran mentioned this, so I won't go into it in detail, just as a link at the bottom for those of you interested in case studies of what's happening across the local authority sector. Indeed, the CARO's worked very closely with the local government management agency on this particular project. The link is at the bottom of the slide. We'll provide examples on everything from sustainable transport to flood risk projects to nature-based solutions and public engagement. So I'll skip on from that slide. I think the role of spatial planning is key, and certainly in terms of this event, and speaking to Sean in advance, was a key role to try and get through as a message. You know, the planning system is an established means to integrate and implement climate change and climate action, really, it should say there, rather than climate change. There certainly is an evolving policy hierarchy in terms of, you know, new roles that, say, the Office of Planning Regulator may have, and indeed guidance on climate action that is pending from the department in terms of how climate action can be incorporated into city and county development plans at a local authority level, which are being reviewed at the moment. Really positive to see the focus on climate in the national planning framework and key objectives in the national planning framework, as well as in regional, spatial and economic strategies, and in particular the Eastern Midlands region has a number of key regional policy objectives on climate action. And as I said, the role that the city and county development plans have in embedding climate action within those county and city development plans. Just going to touch on a couple of examples that Ciaran would have put up as slides, but go up to in a little bit more detail in terms of what the CARO are working on in conjunction with local authorities to help support local authorities in climate action. So WIRE is it's in a beta phase at the moment. It's a weather impact reporting app. It was funded under the government's Public Sector Innovation Grant 2019 and is being led by the CARO Atlantic Seaboard North. And essentially what it is I suppose a real-time app which can be used on phone, tablet, etc., but also back in the office in terms of information you may have gathered that allow local authority staff to log weather impacts. So it could be a high rainfall event, could be a flooding event, could be a coastal event. Allows you to capture that particular information in real time. And I suppose over time allows you to capture photographic information as well as factual information. You may even be able to put in number of staff that were on site, particular water levels, particular pieces of information that can help in assessment of events before and after events. And over time, I suppose when you log all of these events over, a year or two, that you might get a picture across a county level, indeed across a national level, of the particular type of events. So were they coastal events, were they rainfall events, temperature events, and what impacts that they have. Let's have a look. I can't remember the water level being that high. Oh, that water level, that photo shows how high the water level was in that particular event. So very much just suppose trying to build an evidence base, because sometimes emergency response is all about dealing with the issue at the time, and we really need to try and gather more evidence about the impacts and the extents of these particular type of events so that we can plan for the better in the future. Roads as well. I'm sure a lot of you in the audience will have an expertise in terms of roads, and recent weather and extreme events have had an impact on road infrastructure, not just motorways, but regional roads and local roads, as well as bridges. And this is a piece of work being undertaken by the CARO Atlantic Seaboard South. So looking at the strategies in terms, the local authority strategies in terms of the impacts of roads, looking to develop some guidance on how climate action can be integrated into the design, construction, and indeed the maintenance of roads. Things like gully maintenance and ensuring that gullies aren't blocked with leaves and litter may seem quite trivial, but if all your gullies are blocked and you have an extreme rainfall event, you're going to have a flooding event. So the incorporation and mainstreaming of these maintenance actions like gully cleaning, like road cleaning, etc., are really key in terms of how we become more resilient in terms of climate action. And creation of an inventory and mapping system for vulnerable locations, and development of a prioritization method for adaptation intervention. So again, this is ongoing work at the moment, and it's been done in conjunction with Cork Institute of Technology and a number of local authorities from around the country sitting on the steering group. In terms of mitigation, CARO project examples, just touch on a couple here. The woodland scheme, I think Ciaran mentioned trees, and they can be looked at quite simplistically, but the role of afforestation is really key in terms of how we try and deal with climate action, and our afforestation and trees, nature-based solutions indeed as a whole have a really important role to play in climate action. There was an action included in the programme for government for the CAROs to work with public bodies to review land available for planting, providing feedback on the potential by the end of 2020. So this is a work ongoing in conjunction with the Department of Agriculture and Food and Marine, who have a programme open at the moment called the Woodland Creation Scheme, which is funding public bodies, including local authorities, to plant on public land. And it is very much a case of, as a lot of my colleagues and parks departments and biodiversity colleagues, the right tree in the right place. It's not about mass plantation of a particular species across the country just to get the afforestation rate up. It's about the right tree in the right place, and indeed on the right land, as we've seen recently in some areas where we've had vast plantations of trees in bogland, and some of the impacts that can have over time. There is a national working group that's been set up in Teagascar on that working group to help advise from a horticultural perspective, and online surveys and letters have been issued to over 300 public bodies, and there is an aim to prepare a guidance document to assist local authorities and public bodies in terms of implementing more ambitious woodlands planting schemes nationwide. In terms of decarbonising zones, actually myself and Sean, as well as CCMA and SEI, a number of other actors sit on a working group to try and develop this area. It is an action in the National Climate Action Plan for local authorities to identify and develop plans for one decarbonising zone. And for the cynics in the audience, you may say, just one decarbonising zone, you know, are we not trying to decarbonise the entire country? And indeed we are. But this action, I suppose, requires local authorities to at least designate one area which could be replicable across all local authorities, and indeed learnings from those decarbonising zones could spread nationwide. It is an action which is a lead for the Department of Housing, Planning and Local Government. I suppose in terms of looking at this particular action, the CAROs on behalf of the local authority sector, there was no guidance or definition as to what a decarbonising zone was. So in conjunction with CODEMA, the Dublin Energy Agency, the CAROs prepared a position paper which includes examples of what decarbonising zones may be, including case studies, European and national. And that paper is currently being finalised. And just a very quick example of a couple, I suppose you're looking at things like district heating schemes. You know, CODEMA have been working very closely with Dublin City Council and South Dublin County Council on district heating schemes for Halla and indeed Coolbeg. Dundalk Strategic Energy Zone, very much renowned for being, I suppose, the first energy or sort of low carbon zone, and very much a piece of work from Sustainable Energy Ireland and Louth County Council. Portlaoise, low carbon town, really ambitious plans from Laois County Council in terms of Portlaoise, in terms of public transport, modal shift, etc., lighting, electric vehicle charging, and Tipperary County Council in terms of really ambitious plans again for using Lachine Mine and repurposing it in terms of land use as a bioeconomy campus, renewable energy focus as well. So just a couple of examples of what could be considered as decarbonising zones in the national context. I made a slight change from Ciaran's slide in that I'm not going to focus on regional energy bureaus because I think there is a good recognition that there are energy agencies operating in Ireland. There certainly needs to be more of them to assist the public sector and local authorities, and indeed CODEMA, Three County Energy Agency and Tipperary would just be three examples. But an area of focus which I think is getting a lot of interest in the private and local authority sector is the area of electrification of vehicles. The Climate Action Plan requires, you know, has a target of 1 million electric vehicles by 2030. And I, you know, as an environmental scientist, I suppose I'm certainly not an advocate of everybody getting out of their petrol and diesel cars and getting into an electric car. I'm very much an advocate of, you know, the role of public transport, modal shift, even car sharing schemes and vehicle sharing schemes that have a role here. But certainly electrification is happening, and it is part of the transportation solution in terms of climate action. Not the solution, but part of the solution. From a local authority perspective, there's a role there in terms of the fleet that the local authority has, not just, you know, standard vehicles driving on the road, but also the vehicles that are used in parks, used for street cleaning, for waste management, etc. And also plans that local authorities may have in terms of implementing EV charging infrastructure on street. A number of local authorities have taken a start in this and installing pilot smart chargers from lampposts in terms of Dunleary, Fingal, Dublin City have installed some pilots as well, Wicklow, Laois. So it is an area that local authorities are looking at in detail at the moment. SEI have provided a grant, but it is a key question is what the role of the local authority here. The private sector is certainly forging ahead. Many of you will have seen electric vehicle charge points in supermarkets, in car parks and hotels, and indeed the ESB e-cars. So need to be mindful of what the role of the local authority here is, and it's probably very much looking at the role of households and communities that don't have off-street, so private car parking spaces. And for those householders who may wish to make the switch, where can they charge their car?
Sorry, David, on time. We're just out of time.
Okay.
And I want to do some questions. So,
okay, I'll wrap it up quite quickly. Very quickly on knowledge developments. The CAROs have developed quite a comprehensive list of climate action funding. That's going to be on our new web page, which will hopefully be launched in the next couple of weeks. So where local authorities and indeed where communities can access climate action funding. Very close links with third levels, as Ciaran mentioned, and research organisations. I suppose to get to that evidence-based piece that Keith touched on, that a lot of research projects, a lot of science, and how do we translate that science and evidence base in terms of climate impact down to the local authority sector and the role of working with energy agencies, etc. And very quickly. I'll skip through the GAA Green Clubs. Ciaran has touched on that, but again, a key one from a community engagement perspective. A lot of expert partners working on that Green Clubs project, including, you know, SCI, Regional Waste Offices, Irish Water, and the Road Safety Authority. And to finish on our web page, which is in just testing mode at the moment, we hope to launch in the next couple of weeks to highlight what the CAROs are doing, and indeed to highlight the excellent work that local authorities are doing, which I hope I have portrayed in the presentation. And I'm happy to take any questions. These are the contact details for the CARO coordinators. Thanks very much.